everyone, welcome to Neocast, the podcast that brings you closer to your favorite authors. Every month we'll be discussing their journey as writers, their inspirations, writing processes, and much more. Our guest today is Eren Reverie, the author of the fantasy series Moonlight. Hi Eren, it's nice to see you again. I'm glad to have you as my first guest on this podcast, and for the people who may not know who you are, could you briefly introduce yourself and your novel?
Right. I'm Eren Reverie. I write a web serial called Moonlight. I have some other writing as well, but Moonlight is the major piece of work. It's an urban fantasy, paranormal, romance, suspense, comedy, all the genres I could cram in there, basically.
I know the story of how you came up with the idea of Moonlight, which was initially written as a therapy exercise, but could you tell our audience what exactly inspired you?
The anxiety part is fed a lot from my real life experiences. I mean, the anxieties are different from mine. I'm not afraid of the same things that my main character is, but the way the anxieties make you feel is informed by my own experience.
You've mentioned several times that anxiety was the catalyst of your novel, but how does that transpire in your writing?
My main character, Abigail, in Moonlight, has a severe case of generalized anxiety disorder. It's not diagnosed because she's too anxious about people thinking she's strange to actually seek out help for it, but she's very aware of it. And so it has a factor, an impact on almost everything that she does from the beginning of the story forward. It's just that as the story progresses, the things that she is anxious about shift from being things that she knows aren't real, that it's an irrational anxiety, to things that shouldn't be real, but because we're in a paranormal suspense world, somehow are.
It's actually quite surprising that you added supernatural elements since it was initially a narrative about yourself.
I had an outline for a romance novel. And then, like I said, I got really annoyed with paranormal romance novels' protagonists and the way they behaved and how that seems so nonsensical to me. Like, I'm sorry, a 300-year-old vampire has been around long enough to not be stupidly jealous all the time. You know? Werewolves are controlled by this bestial monster once a month, so the rest of the time they're gonna want to keep their calm in response to that, I would think. You know, a lot of things didn't set with me right. So I started by grafting on the romance novel story arc that I had written, which, I don't want to go into spoilers to the people who haven't read it, but a lot of those things do show up in the novel. Not exactly as I had intended when I started writing it. Abby's romantic interests aren't quite the same as the ones I intended, but I started with that, and as I was writing, I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if all of the things she's afraid of are actually real?
Actually, I wouldn't call it wonderful. I think I would rather call it dreadful.
It's one of those things where sometimes I worry that my readers are going to read what I'm writing and they're going to look at it and they're going to think, Eren is a horrible person. Who comes up with this? Why would she make people go through that? Oh, I'm afraid of the judgment of my readers. I try to be entertaining because I don't want them to be like, you're a horrible person, but I have to see how this ends because I'm afraid for the... I try to make it so that the bad things that happen to my characters are from a more external source. Like, Abby's relationships, the ones that she actually gets into, are healthy. The ones where the person would be an unhealthy relationship candidate, even though some of my readers root for those, they don't happen. Abby recognizes them in a way that I myself was unable to. So I try to avoid certain kinds of harm, I suppose I should say. And a lot of that has to do with the interpersonal relationships. So instead, much of the threat in the stories, the plot device that's driving it, is external forces acting on her life that she has to respond to.
What you were saying about healthy relationships in romance novels is very compelling. I feel like the most praised romances have been rather toxic. Well, I think that IRL, it's not a dynamic that you'd ever want for yourself. So I guess my question is, why do you think it's so popular?
I know that socially we advocate in general for monogamy, which can be healthy, but also has built-in kind of elements of possessiveness that are potentially toxic if taken to an extreme. And it seems like things almost always get taken to an extreme by someone and then romanticized. I read an excessive number of romance novels. It's ridiculous. I read a lot of novels, but I read a ridiculous amount of romance novels. In large part because I was trying to understand how people who don't work like me work. I've come to discover that I myself am asexual, which is really surprising if you read Midnight Moonlight, because Abby definitely is. But, so like, I don't understand what a normal feeling of attraction is, because I don't experience that myself. So I read these books in order to get a general idea. This is the sort of thing that resonates with people. People identify with this. This is what they see as attractive. And in the process, of course, I've read many romance novels that are, objectively speaking, horrible. Just possessive relationships, excessive codependency, and things like that. And as a fantasy, I can see the appeal. I mean, I can certainly see, as someone who has struggled in life, how appealing it would be to meet someone who really cares about you and will take care of you and make sure everything is okay. Like, that's very alluring. But I wouldn't want to actually experience it to the extreme that I lose my ability to care for myself. And I think that's the point at which it flips over to fantasy, or to toxicity, is when it reaches the point where the main character is sacrificing portions of themselves and their goals and dreams and their ability to pursue those on their own, in favor of this sort of like joined entity of them and their romantic lead. So I think that's where things become toxic, and that's part of why I have polyamory as an element in Midnight Moonlight, is because it allows me to directly explore expressions of jealousy, and also possessiveness, and how people can interact without those becoming a central part of the relationship, or something that changes how you relate with others. I've heard so many people say something like, after getting in a relationship, they couldn't hang out with their male friends or their female friends or whatever. And that boggles my mind. And it always has. And so it's something that I wanted to explore in my writing more.
Yeah, and the media in general tends to discredit gender-opposite friendships in heterosexual narratives. Like, when you're in a relationship, being friends with the gender that you're attracted to is seen as bad and jeopardizing for your relationship.
I vaguely remember watching When Harry Met Sally years ago, this movie, and what I vaguely remember from it is that there's a scene where the female lead says that a woman and a man can be friends and just be friends. And the man says, no, a woman and a man can't be friends and just be friends. The man wants to get with the woman. And then much later, when the man is actually pursuing her, he says, you know, a woman and a man can just be friends. I'm just being your friend. And yeah, it's definitely in the media that a woman and a man can't just be friends. You see that all the time as a plot device, even, where there's the male best friend who's secretly in love with the female lead who's falling for a bad boy and it hurts him so much.
Don't you think that there's a double standard? Like, you usually hear people say that they could never get involved with this or that person, arguing that it's because they're like family, but that only seems to apply to people that they, I assume, don't consider as attractive in the first place, or that aren't commonly attractive, you know. So there's a sort of superficial element to what could be considered as a threat to your partner and relationship.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that too, where if the male best friend is the really dorky, kind of clumsy guy, he's not deemed a threat. So the romantic lead doesn't ever get jealous of him, but they still play the trope that he's in love with the female lead. So there is a whole thing about whether or not someone is perceived as a threat is certainly a double standard. Like, any woman who's interested in the male lead is perceived as a threat, but any man who's interested in the female lead is only a threat if he's also dashing and clever.
There's also a reluctance to see and portray women as being able to cheat, unless it's a horrible person. Like, it's easier to picture a man cheat than a woman.
You're much more likely to see it portrayed as a man who has multiple relationships than a woman who has multiple relationships. And if you really want to get into some of the double standards that you see in that kind of thing, read reverse harem novels. There's an entire subset of the genre, of the romance genre, that is the reverse harem, where it's a female lead with multiple male partners. And there is a trope in those where the female lead at some point has to get all of the guys together and have them discuss, are you all okay with this, that I have more than one partner? It's so abnormal. Are you going to be jealous of each other? And all of this thing that you don't really see in harem novels. Like, if you read a novel where there's the main character guy who's dashing and cool and somehow manages to have every woman he meets fall in love with him, even though he only is really interested in the one, he never has that conversation with all of his partners. But it's in almost every reverse harem novel I've ever seen. It's very much a double standard in how female protagonists and male protagonists are treated in the same sort of setting.
Polyamory is also a bold move for a writer. I guess it's because most people, and me included, are more used to monogamy and monogamous narratives. And people tend to shame, or maybe not shame, but rather lack understanding of polyamory.
There's a character in my story, Emma, who talks about one of her previous relationships. And she says that she went into that relationship explaining that she was polyamorous and what it meant. And that the person she was with interpreted that as a polite way to say that she was a swinger, which isn't what polyamory is. And so when Emma started falling for another character, the original person she was with suddenly couldn't accept it. And that's, I think, how polyamory gets portrayed in the media. It's like a dog whistle for cheating, or like, you know, if you're gonna be a cheater, but you don't want the stigma of being a cheater, you say you're polyamorous instead. Like, that's the fancy, nice term. But that's not what it is, because I've seen people in polyamorous relationships who actually do cheat. It blows my mind. I can't understand it. Why would you be in a polyamorous relationship and cheat on your partner? But the distinction is really just that your partner isn't aware of what's going on and isn't okay with it. That's all the distinction is. If you're in more than one romantic relationship and all of the members of those relationships are aware of each other and are okay with it, that's polyamory in a nutshell.
A mutual agreement should be the base of those relationships, and any relationship, actually. I noticed that many unhealthy or dysfunctional relationships can find roots in miscommunication or a complete lack of communication, actually.
I really wanted to do romance right in my novels and portray a healthy relationship. And Abby has serious communication problems. problems, something that she is aware of, and something that she has made her partners aware of, so that they know that she has difficulty communicating and they can be patient with her or broach subjects on their own. But in a lot of romance novels, the main plot device seems to be a misunderstanding or an assumption that just never gets cleared up until the very end, and then it is cleared up and everything's perfect again. And no one addresses the fact that having had this misunderstanding indicates an underlying lack of trust that is really damaging to the relationship as a whole.
Talking things out and acknowledging miscommunication is definitely something that is missing in mainstream fiction. And just like you said, as I grew up, I became frustrated with how romance was depicted in fiction, especially in teen fiction. Most likely, those adult writers have been trying to draw a narrative that they believed would appeal to younger generations. What they were really doing was setting a set of toxic ideals, which is now the reason why I value being able to convey healthy standards and normalizing authenticity in fiction.
College, I took philosophy for a variety of kind of stupid reasons, I will admit. And I like to tell people it so that when I'm out of work, I can be philosophical about it. But my final project was on the ethics of artwork. And specifically, as artists influence society in a way that persists past their own lifetime, what kind of responsibility does an artist as a creative person have in creating their art? And there's lots of back and forth on it, but my personal take on it was that there is a responsibility to use fiction to tell truths, is if it is something that resonates truly. And I think that there is a responsibility for artists, writers, creative people of all types to wield the influence they have in a responsible manner. Because people who've never had experience with these topics, their first experience with it could be your work. And if that's the case, then that matters a lot. It's the whole first impressions thing. Only they're not getting their first impression from a person who's dealing with this, but with your character, who they potentially know far more intimately than they would know an actual other person. Because if you meet another person with anxiety, you might not know at all because you can't see what's going on in their head. But with Abby, you get every thought as it's occurring. So you know her far better than you know your friend Joe at the office, who never really gets together with people and is kind of quiet but seems like he's okay. But they could have very similar issues. Anxiety is one of those invisible problems where it can greatly impact someone's life, but it doesn't necessarily show on the outside, and so people tend to discount it. Likewise, any kind of minority group or situation or lifestyle is something where it's not necessarily visible on the outside, like particularly with lifestyle minorities. Like, you don't necessarily know if someone is gay or lesbian when you're just looking at them. You just don't. So if your first known impression of someone like that is reading conservative Christian fiction where they're the evil creature trying to destroy healthy romantic relationships and drag the pastor into the fires of brimstone, you're gonna have a different impression than if your first encounter with a LGBT person is a coming out story. So with romances in particular, like I said, I was very annoyed with the amount of unhealthy romance I was reading. And since I have this belief that there is a responsibility with authors to portray, to tell truths, and hopefully in a way that is beneficial to the reader, like helping the reader identify things that would be unhealthy. And yes, you're using extremes when you're writing, but still, because of that, I very much want Abby's relationships to remain healthy relationships. And there will be misunderstandings and things like that, but they'll be addressed. They won't fester for an entire book. People will talk things out. One of the tropes that particularly bothers me in young adult fiction is when the female lead meets their first romantic partner and it's perfect. Like, that's the one. It's the first one, but it's also the one, and it's going to last forever. That's your happily ever after. It's not a realistic standard. And I personally feel that kind of sets young women up to potentially get into an abusive relationship and think that, no, this is the one. They're the one I fell for. I'm never going to fall for someone else. That's not how it works. And our relationship is just like it is in these stories that I've been told are the best you can get from a relationship. I mean, he wants to know where I am all the time. This, that, and the other thing, and I think it's an immense disservice to young women.
I agree. I actually hate that trope of the one, which not only does not fit reality, but is also detrimental for people who find themselves in unhappy, unhealthy, or abusive relationships. But moving on to your writing, which is itself immersed in your personal experience, we know that Midnight Moonlight started as a therapy exercise, but can you tell us how you first got into writing?
I have to say escapism. Like, flat out escapism is how it started. Mostly. I read a lot as a child. A lot of reading. And that was purely escapism. Sassenach, the Planet Pirates, the Dragon Riders of Pern, things like that. Most of them have female protagonists because I was deeply in the closet and I identified with a female protagonist, but could not express that in any other way in my life. So I read a lot. And then I started writing a lot so that I had ways to express myself badly most of the time. And still without really a lot of awareness of what was going on in my head while I was doing this. But I initially started writing because I had all of these ideas for stories because I was trying to avoid my own life. And that's really what started me with writing in general. I started taking it seriously, though, when my parents started pressuring me about what I wanted to do when I grew up. Because I was deeply afraid of being a failure. I was deeply afraid of not being able to do things right. I mean, I couldn't even boy write, So I was afraid I was going to screw up. And somehow, in my mind, I figured out writing was the one thing that I couldn't screw up. Because if I'm writing my own fantasy story in my own fantasy world, no one can tell me I'm getting it wrong. It all comes from me to begin with. And so it was both a safety net and an escape, in that I couldn't mess it up because no one else could really say how to do it right, because no one else could create the same things I created. And it got me out of my regular headspace. I tend to write stream of consciousness, so just as things are coming up in my head, I'm writing them down, and there's very little editing in my process. But I get really absorbed in it. I have a lot of difficulty starting, but once I start writing, it's that whole in the zone thing where you're really focused and you're not paying attention to the rest of the world. And that was kind of the point for me. I could get in the zone, I could get into a character's headspace, and I didn't have to pay attention to the world that was really messed up around me. In middle school, I entered the Young Authors Contest every year. And at least part of that was because my parents pressured me to do so, because if I was going to be a writer, I had to be published. Like in early middle school, I told my parents that I wanted to be a writer when I grew up. I finally answered their question. And my mom's response was something along the lines of, how can you be serious about wanting to be a writer? You're not even published yet. And it was incredibly demoralizing. But I was pressured to publish, and the only way I had to do so at the time that I could wrap my own head around was this young authors contest, the award for which was having your book put in the school library. Like, that was the only place it was published. But that's when I first contemplated publishing. It was on that small scale. On the grand scale of like traditional publishing, it wasn't until after college that I made that attempt. And I say attempt because it was an utter failure. I still wasn't diagnosed for my anxiety. It was still a massive impact on my life. I didn't have any medication for it or anything like that either. And I wrote this book, Aeronox, which was briefly published online, but has disappeared into the background of the internet. I wrote it on my lunch breaks as a substitute teacher. During any 15-minute snatch of time in that hundreds of notebooks I had, I would write as much as I could. I wrote a stupid amount while I was supposed to be socializing with my grandparents-in-law. But yeah, I finished an entire book. Like, the whole thing. I was so proud. I had it finished. All I had to do was send it to the publishers. I got a copy of the Writer's Market. I looked up publishers that would be interested. I created the cover letter. I got the envelope, put the first chapter and the cover letter and the synopsis in the envelope, sealed it up. All I had to do was get postage, and I couldn't do it. I broke down in my living room holding onto that envelope, trying to make myself go to the post office. I threw up, I cried, and I still have that envelope in a drawer.
Do you regret never having sent that envelope?
Yes and no. Most of my regret about not sending in the envelope is that I would have liked to have been the kind of person who wouldn't break down trying to send in the envelope. That's what I really regret. Isn't that I failed to send it in, but that I couldn't send it in. I couldn't make myself. I didn't have whatever it is that it took to do that thing. That really, all it had to do was be put in the mailbox. That was it. I just needed stamps and in the mailbox. And again, my anxiety just didn't permit it. And that distresses me, that my anxiety had that much control over my life. Much more than the fact that I didn't send the book in. Because, let's be honest, it's my first book. I would have gotten hundreds of rejections, and it probably would not have gotten published, as far as I can tell.
I get that feeling, or rather that fear of knowing you physically can't receive rejection, and I hope it's not something that you're blaming yourself for. While being afraid of rejection may be common to all of us, it must be even worse for creators and authors when it comes to their work.
My anxiety, I was diagnosed also with severe generalized anxiety. It's the same thing that Abby would be diagnosed with if she were. And I take medication for it. I'm confident that the main source of my anxiety, aside from like traumas in my life, is simply put a chemical imbalance that I was probably born with, and it would have manifested one way or another, no matter what I lived through. But what I did live through made it so that a lot of my anxiety focuses on imposter syndrome and fear of failure, fear of failing to live up to expectations in particular. Because, like I said, I couldn't even boy write. And that's what I was expected to be. And I just wasn't. So I spent most of my life pretending to be someone I wasn't. And then I told people I wanted to be a writer. And the prospect that I would be told, no, you're not good enough to do this, would have been like confirmation that that was fake too. But yeah, I do think that writers tend to be nervous about this in general, even without the disorders level of anxiety.
Speaking of anxiety, have you received any comments about how people were able to relate to Abby?
Yes, I have gotten those comments, and those are particularly important to me, I think, because it meant that I'm doing something right. You don't typically see the main character suffer from something like extreme anxiety. I grew up thinking that the way I behaved wasn't suitable for main character status. I was convinced I was going to be a side character in my own life. And no one should really feel that way. And so I'm glad people can identify with Abby. I think almost as important are the comments I get from people who say, I don't suffer from anxiety like Abby does, but a friend of mine does, and I think I understand them a little better now.
I know that you're right in stream of consciousness, so can we safely say that your writing process is based on what you're experiencing at the moment?
A lot of it goes back to when I was a Dungeons & Dragons dungeon master. The story would get made up on the spot. Players would tell me what their characters were doing, and I would tell them how the world reacts around them. With my writing, I don't do a lot of outlining, and when I do outline, I tend to deviate frequently. Usually what I know going into any given chapter is that I know what the main villain's plot is. I know what their goal is. So I know what's going to be happening over there where the readers aren't necessarily seeing. And from there, I'm just writing Abby going through her regular life and then colliding with those events or the things that have propagated from those events. But yeah, it is very influenced by what I'm imagining as I'm writing, not necessarily what I'm personally feeling, because I do try to divorce myself from that and get into the headspace of the character. It's kind of like method acting. It's method writing. If I were this character, what would I be doing? That's how I write.
I've noticed that so far you've been quite vague about the story's whereabouts and about other identifying details. Is it something that was important to you to blur those kind of lines between reality and your fiction?
I leave a lot of things non-specific and let the reader fill in details. I try to give fairly general descriptions of people so that imaginations can fill in the specifics. So like I might note that someone is handsome or physically well-built or beautiful in a curvaceous manner or something like that. But it's up to the reader to portray the rest. And likewise, with the city, it's a generic any city because the story could take place in any city. The city itself is not central to the plot. And likewise, just many other things. If it's not central to the plot, I've been pretty vague about it. A large number of the cast don't have last names, just because last names tend to carry an implication of where you came from. And I'm willing to let people identify them how they would like to identify them, as far as what their backgrounds would be. There's a thing with reading that I've been aware of where people tend to associate the characters in the books they read with themselves and people they know, unless they're specifically told otherwise. And I don't want to specifically tell people that you can't fit into this universe, or people like you don't belong in this world. And so I do, the deliberate part is I don't want to mess it up. To that extent, I'm very deliberate about leaving out details. I'm very afraid of writing people who belong to different ethnicities than me, because I'm afraid of screwing up the culture. Because I'm very isolated, and I don't have a strong impression of what other people's cultures are like. And I don't want to screw it up, and I don't want to create microaggressions, but I also don't want to exclude them. Like, I don't want my work to be like that town I grew up in where everything looks fine because those people don't exist. That's just screwed up. So like I said, I introduced some characters about when I was becoming aware of Black Lives Matters, and I kind of want to write a spin-off of just them, but I'm afraid to, because they are very much from a culture and a background different from mine. They grew up in a city, and I grew up in the country. They are people of color, and I'm a pasty white girl. I fear that I can't do them justice.
Even if you think that you're not able to write racially diverse characters at the moment, I'm still positive that we're gonna see more of your writing, and I, for one, am looking forward to see how you will explore your superhero novel idea with the transgender MC and multiple universes.
Yeah, that's one of the things with publishing Midnight Moonlight is I had not published online before, chapter at a time, while everything was going up. That was a new experience with me with Midnight Moonlight. The book I had written before it, Aeronox, the one that I failed to send to a publisher, I wrote the whole thing on my own, without readers, beta readers. No one else had read it, anything like that. And although I failed to send it into a publisher, one of the things that that experience did was it taught me that I was able to write a book. And since I knew I was able to write a book, I was not afraid to start publishing chapter by chapter online, because I wasn't afraid that I would lose it midway through and stop writing and not finish the story for the readers, which is what had prevented me from writing online before. I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to hack it. But that book taught me that I could write a book, and so I took that with Midnight Moonlight going forward, and that helped a lot with my writing. And it is part of why I have hope that going forward I will resume writing, because I've been through really bad spells in high school and college where my creativity came in fits and bursts, and it never finished things. I've been through that experience, and it's very similar to what I've been going through now. Like, I'm back to the point where I'm having ideas again. I'm still having trouble writing them down, but I'm having the ideas again, and I recognize that from my past. I know from my past experience that interacting with readers contributes to my desire to write. Knowing that they are anticipating what's going to happen next and are excited about it makes me want to write what happens next. And I'll admit, when we first started communicating about this interview, I got really excited about my writing again because people cared. And I've said that the support of my people on Patreon, even though I'm pausing the donations while I'm not writing, has been helpful to me, because it is support. It is people who are there who are saying, hey, we're interested in what you do, and we will be interested when you start doing it again. I've also started getting more people reading on Royal Road. I'm not actually writing. I'm still publishing the archives. I think they're somewhere in book 3 now. I think I put up book 3, chapter 30 today. Yeah, that sounds about right. So I still have like 3 more books worth of chapters before I have to write something in order to update on Royal Road, which is taking the pressure off from me. But I'm starting to get comments there, and I'm getting really excited because I'm engaging with the community again. And I feel like that's another thing that's making me think I'm going to be writing in the future, because I'm going to be engaged with these people, and we're going to run out of chapters, and I'm not going to want to let them down. I think the biggest thing with publishing online has been the community in the comments section. That has been a huge help. My experience with writing my first book, where I was writing it on my own time and cramming it in every second, it was hard. It was work. It was a slog, and it was a lot of pressure on myself. Writing Midnight Moonlight, once I started getting people commenting on it and anticipating the next chapter, I was writing on my lunch breaks, and I was writing every 15 minutes that I could get it crammed in, but I was excited because once it went up, I would get to see people's response. And that was a huge deal for me, and I think that makes publishing online a lot easier than publishing traditionally. Because with traditional publishing, you have to build this entire work without much support, at least in my experience. I wasn't able to find beta readers. My spouse wasn't interested in reading my books, all of that sort of thing. So no support writing. And then you have this finished product, and you don't have any idea if it's actually good or not. And you have to give it out for someone to accept or reject. It's pass-fail. That's terrifying. When I was writing on the original site, people weren't just reading, I wasn't interacting with people while they were reading my book. I was interacting with people while I was writing my book that they were reading. Because every time I finished a chapter, I would post it, right then. So, yeah, there's definitely that level of interaction that just doesn't exist elsewhere. And that didn't frequently affect where the story went, but after a while, I started doing weekend bonus chapters. If I got enough views or enough votes on webfiction.com, I would say, if I get enough votes, I'll write an extra chapter for the weekend. Who do you want that chapter to be about? And the bonus chapters would not be about Abby specifically. She wouldn't be the point of view character, and she would frequently not even be in the scene. Because if Abby's in the scene, she's the main character. So people would say, well, I want to know what's going on with John the Ghoul, or I want to know what Hans has been doing during all of this, or what is the Council of Vampires think about what's going on? I think it would be hilarious to see their misunderstanding of Abby. And so all of those chapters that are sprinkled in the book, even points of view for main characters like Abby's two best friends, Fumiko and Megan, all of those were written because readers were like, what are they up to right now? And in that fashion, the readers have had direct impact on the story itself. Because in a lot of cases, I think the story wouldn't have progressed the way it went if we didn't have those points of view. If we didn't see how Megan dealt with a specific situation, because I'm trying to avoid spoilers, but if we didn't see how Megan dealt with that situation, there wouldn't be the setup for when Abby gets there and things have devolved in this sort of off-kilter way. It would be too arbitrary. Or if Abby gets to a location where we know bad guys are at and have been doing things, and all of this other stuff has happened there, it wouldn't make as much sense without the background knowledge that you got because you read the story of Daniel, who was there when Abby wasn't and was doing things. And so the readers saying, well, what are these people doing? Combined with, like I said, I wrote like a Dungeons and Dragons DM, which is basically the readers are giving me characters and I need to make a plot. And that has definitely shaped the way Midnight Moonlight has developed. Those characters that I introduced around when I was becoming involved with Black Lives Matters, and when I was becoming aware of that situation, they had a few side character chapters. And because of their side character chapters, I really want to see a series for them specifically. I don't feel that I'm qualified to write it. So at some point in the future, I would perhaps be open to collaborating with someone, because it would require that. I could write it, but I couldn't do it justice, and I would be afraid to do it badly because I don't want to be that person. And I'm aware of my limitations. But yeah, side characters have become very important in ways that were quite unexpected by myself. Like, I wasn't expecting all of this stuff to happen with Daniel, and yeah, people who were supposed to be like a one-off character suddenly have a background and a history and their own motivations and are becoming Abby's friends. And what? But it's beautiful and it's wonderful and it's much more like real life, I think, where everyone is the main character of their own story. That's really how I try to write the side character chapters. The side character chapters are a snippet of that character's story where they are the main character.
I like the point you're making about developing side characters. And there's obviously a growing interest from readers in getting to know side characters better. But prior to that, a recurring trope was to write side characters as one-dimensional entities whose sole existence revolved around the MC. And I'm glad it's something that you're not doing in Midnight Moonlight.
Yeah, the idea of one-dimensional side characters is very common in writing, and also like Mary Sue characters and things like that, characters that fit an archetype and don't change. But I was originally planning on writing Midnight Moonlight as slice of life, which meant that the plot, insofar as I expected there to be a plot, was going to be based on character change. It was going to be character development, watching Abby's character development. And so that has always been a strong aspect, I think, of Midnight Moonlight, is watching her not just deal with the problems that are coming at her from outside, but adapt and learn to deal with her own internal issues better and better herself. But at the same time, when I make a character outline, I only ask a few questions of myself when I'm writing a character outline, and they are, how do other people see this character? How does this character see themselves? What does this character say they want? And what does this character actually want? And those 4 questions are what I try to define for every character in Midnight Moonlight who gets a speaking role. And with just that much, you can write someone's story. And I think that helps keep my characters from becoming one-dimensional. Yeah. Because each of them has a goal, even if I never specify what it is. Like, I can tell you about, I've forgotten names. Carl, way back when, who works in the publishing house with Abby. He has goals. Some of Abby's coworkers that are never mentioned by name, they have aspirations within the publishing industry that I am aware of, because at some point in the future that might be a factor, because the publishing house exists in Abby's world, and it could be an interesting plotline. It also helps a lot with my writing style, because I write stream of consciousness, and because I write in this sort of, these characters are in a situation, how would they react kind of a way. Having that kind of a framework for my characters makes it so that if I end up writing to the point where the people in a scene consist of Abby and the owner of the bar at another name that is Luminescence, the owner of Club Luminescence and Abby are in a scene together, how is he supposed to react in that scene? Well, I kind of have a little bit of guidance, because I have those 4 questions for him. I know what his goals are, and I know how he would respond to Abby's interactions. And so that gives me a sort of an outline to progress from. And it helps a lot when characters that I didn't necessarily know were going to become important do become more involved in the plot, because they remain consistent in who they are. And that's a very important part of a side character, but also because there's these separations in those 4 questions. What do they want? What do they actually need? How do people see them? How do they see themselves? There's more nuance in how they can interact, and how they can interact both with when it's from Abby's point of view and she's witnessing their actions, and then if they get a side character chapter, their own perspective of their actions, which is not necessarily the same at all.
We'd love to have you in another podcast to discuss your writing process in depth, because I think that you have a compelling insight to share. But to wrap this episode, could you tell us about a book that impacted your writing?
I've had a few. One of the books that impacted my writing was, oh my goodness, why is the name escaping me? There was an online web novel that I read that had a strong influence in how I started writing Midnight Moonlight. It was an LGBT cast, it was a fantasy setting, and it was very open about matters of sexuality and things like that. And that strongly influenced my willingness to be open about those matters as well. I was also strongly influenced in being open about those matters because I've mentioned I'm asexual and I don't understand attraction the way normal people do. So I was kind of like trying to do exposure therapy with Abby because I was very uncomfortable talking about it because it didn't make sense to me. So I figured I'll just talk about it a lot and I'll get past that. Mileage varied. But so that book had a lot of influence, or that series of books. I wish it was by Alexandra Eren. Tales of MU. That was the series. It had a strong impact, and I'm actually quite a ways behind in that by now. I haven't been reading it for a while. I tend to binge read things. Yeah. Worm was another web novel that has had an impact on my writing, with having a main character that is not necessarily a heroine trope. But I've also been influenced by more traditional novels like The Curse of Chalion, which has a male protagonist who was a general in a war and had to surrender his post and was sold off to the enemy and comes home a very broken person. And the story is about him as a broken person getting embroiled in politics and both trying to put himself back together but also protect the people around him from these court intrigues. And that has definitely had an impact as well because, I mean, you can see with Abby, she is a person who has been through a lot of damage. And she is not just trying to take care of herself, but the people around her. And the idea that that could be a hero, like I had wanted that to be a hero in the past, but The Curse of Chalion was the first place where I actually saw it.
And one final question, do you have any tips to share to get started with writing?
That's a very hard one because I think a lot of people will struggle with different aspects. Like, for me, the best anyone could give me is just start writing, dang it. Because that is the thing that hangs me up the most. But for people who are struggling to just get started, from my experience, writing online is easier for getting started than writing for traditional publishing. With traditional publishing, you have to have a completed work, or you have to be able to sell that you can complete a work. And if you haven't published before, you have less odds of being accepted because publishing houses are businesses. They're going to want a sure sale. And there's the whole thing with you getting 100 rejections before you get an acceptance. It doesn't actually mean anything about the quality of your writing. It's just, are they willing to take a bet on you financially? If you're just getting started writing and you're writing online, though, you can write chapter by chapter, get feedback from readers. You still have the safety of being anonymous on the internet.
Well, thank you for answering our questions, Eren, and thank you for being here with us. I hope that we'll see you soon in another podcast to discuss more about your writing process and the writing processes that you've encountered before or that you know about.
I would be thrilled. I enjoy talking about the writing process and different people's writing processes and story theory. Enjoy that a lot. So I would be happy to be here again. I was glad to be here this time. And again, thank you for having me here.
Thank you again for your time, Eren. I really can't wait to read what you'll write in the future. For the people who are listening to this podcast, let us know your thoughts on our social media. And until next time, keep on reading and stay safe.